Good afternoon, everybody. Let's make a start so that we can have as much time as possible to devote to our webinar. So my name is Patrick Diamond. I'm a Professor of Public Policy here at Queen Mary. I'm also Director of the Marland Institute, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this webinar this afternoon. The webinar is looking at the reform of the centre of government, and there are three particular reasons why we wanted to host this session today. The first is that Ray Shostak, Martin Alessandro, who I'll introduce in a moment, and myself have recently produced a new piece of research looking at international lessons from reform of the centre of government, and we wanted to share some of those insights with you today. The second reason, I think, is that this debate's particularly important in the UK at the present time because there is a real sense that the centre of government has not been working as effectively and as efficiently as it should have been. That's partly, I think, to do with some of the issues around the handling of the pandemic and COVID-19. But it also, I think, relates to other long-term issues about how effective the centre of government is at dealing with coordination, joining up policy making, ensuring better delivery, and so on. And I think the third reason why we wanted to host a session today is that, of course, in the UK, in the next few months or so, we have the prospect of a change of government, a new government coming to power. And of course, there are some big questions, not just about what policies that new government will introduce, but also how it will deliver them and how it will achieve its commitments and objectives. And the 5 missions that the leader of the opposition has set out will partly depend on the effectiveness and the cutting edge that's provided by the centre of government. So those are reasons why we thought hosting this session today was particularly important. And some of the questions we're going to discuss include, should there be a major reform, such as the introduction of a Prime Minister's department in the UK? Is there a need for a change in the role of the Treasury? What is the right blend of central units at the centre of government? Should there be a delivery unit? Should there be policy unit? Should there be a strategy unit? And so on. What is the role of the centre in terms of strengthening capacity for policy implementation? And finally, what can the United Kingdom learn from a vast array of international experience in terms of how to organise a centre of government effectively? So to consider these questions and issues, we've got 3 excellent speakers with us this afternoon. The first is Ray Shostak. Ray will be known to many of you. He's an international advisor on government performance, but between 2007 and 2011, he was head of the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit and also Director General of Performance Management and a member of the board of the Treasury. He's also held a number of senior roles in local government. And I'm also delighted to say that Ray is a visiting professor here at Queen Mary and a member of the Marland Institute. Second, we're joined by Martin Alessandro. Martin is an international consultant on the Centre of Government Reform and Performance Management. He previously led the delivery unit in Argentina's capital city, and he's also served in the Office of the Chief of Cabinet at the federal level. Martin writes extensively about the Centre of Government issues, and he also teaches graduate courses at several universities, as well as co-authoring a series of reports, including the one that I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar. And then finally, we're joined by Caroline Slocock. Caroline's a former civil servant who worked as the first female private secretary in 10 Downing Street between 1989 and 1991. She then went on to work after Margaret Thatcher for John Major in Number 10. And after leaving Number 10, she worked in the Treasury for 9 years, where she advised the Chancellor on public sector priorities, as well as reforming the public expenditure system. And after working in central government, Caroline was also chief executive of the Equal Opportunities Commission between 2002 and 2007. So we're delighted to be joined by our 3 speakers this afternoon. The webinar is going to be structured as follows. Ray is going to begin by setting out some thoughts based on his experience and also the report which we've authored. Martin will follow and very much provide an international perspective, drawing on a comparative analysis of how the centre of government works in other countries. And then very much last but not least, Caroline will then give a response based on her experience working in the centre of government in the UK. I should say that once we've had those contributions, there'll be hopefully plenty of time for discussion. And if you do have questions, please put those in the chat box and we'll try and get through as many questions and comments as we can during the session. So with that, it's my pleasure now to hand over to Ray Shostak.
Great. Thanks very much, Patrick. And thanks, everybody, for joining us. Can you see the slides? Fine, good. Again, thanks everybody for joining. You've got a lot of other things to do, and it's nice that you've been able to spend some time with us. As Patrick said, I'm going to introduce some of the issues that have emerged from the piece of work we've done with particular reference to the UK. I've just selected some of them that I thought might be relevant. Of course, there are a whole lot more, but really mostly just to start the discussion, both now and indeed through email if folk want to bother. We'll put the link to the book on the website. You can download it for free. And again, if anybody wants to follow it up, I'd welcome the chance to dialogue with people about it. Let's get into it. The center of government can be constructed in a number of different ways and thought about in a number of different ways. We've actually used a functional approach. And so in that top bit of text, I've highlighted some of the functions that we've put into the structure of the book: strategic management, coordination, performance, accountability, the intelligence or analytical capacity, and the culture and capability. That's one way of thinking about it in terms of functions rather than actual structures, which some countries do. It would be worth saying that all countries have a center of government. There's no one single model, and they have it either explicitly or implicitly. What we hope the book will do is help people think a bit more explicitly about it. And they're all on a journey to make their governments better. The second way of thinking about it is actually the institutional structure. In the book, we actually highlight that we see the center of government not as organizationally, but more variable in terms of, and porous in terms of different times and different work that they'll be doing. But it will always include the senior leadership, institutions that provide the cross-government functions, as Patrick mentioned, delivery units, strategy units, and so on, or institution and teams for specific purposes. More latterly, governments have actually begun to form units in terms of particularly the digital work. The third way of thinking about it is actually thinking about the center of government is the engine of government, or the steering wheel of government, or indeed the nerve system of government. Again, discuss. The fourth alternative is, of course, you're trying to avoid it being the flat tire of government. And that's the best joke you're getting today. In terms of the current UK landscape, and this is, again, just some aspects. As Patrick said, the COVID inquiry has exposed through its WhatsApps and other testimony the fact that Downing Street is less of the Swiss watch efficiency that you might have thought it was, or people might expect it to be. And that's got to be an issue that any new administration needs to think about. Similarly, the civil service has been seriously challenged, what I guess Patrick and his research would call the public sector bargain, public service bargain, in terms of the relationships between ministers and civil servants. I have to say, I'm not implying there. One of the strengths of the UK civil service, as I work internationally now, is the civil service. And one of the strengths of the UK government is the civil service. In a very real sense, there'll be a challenge in terms of motivating the civil service and re-energizing the civil service from some of the more challenging years that it's had, including the sacking of Tom Scholar and others. The disconnect with public services is very real. I'll refer to that a bit more in a second. But at the end of the day, I just put that up, reminding people that the government doesn't actually itself provide many public services directly. It relies on others to provide the services. And so its role is to create the enabling climate for that. And the center of government has a real significant role in creating that climate. The lack of budgetary alignment with priorities is always a challenge for governments, particularly in the recent years in terms of the austerity and, of course, the extra COVID expenditure. And as always, not just unique to the UK, the declining trust in government. Now, I've put the visuals there in terms of what is normally regarded as the core element of the UK civil service, discuss, which is Downing Street, the Cabinet Office, and the Treasury. And again, what we found in terms of our international work is the importance of the role of the Treasury within that. Inevitably, Downing Street and the Cabinet Office are, for all intents and purposes, spending departments, and the Treasury will always be the Treasury. But the most effective centers of government are when there's an alignment with the Prime Minister's office and the Treasury. Again, more of that as we go through. I've now got a few slides, and you'll be delighted to know, those of you who know me, who will recognize I can hardly say good afternoon in 12 minutes, that I'm going to be reasonably quick as I go through them, again, to start the discussion. This first one is just what we found in terms of very often governments panicking midway through an administration when they realize they haven't quite got done what they put in their manifesto or in their government programs. And so one of the bits of advice that comes out of the work we did is that new administrations need to be clear what they want and what they can achieve in one parliament. Now, that changes quite a lot in terms of the challenges of the new technologies and the new data that's available to us. But actually being clear what you want to achieve, starting from the end of the administration, working back, is quite an important issue to consider. Similarly, there's a lot of debate about whether or not the first 100 days is a significant milestone or not. The important bit here is establish what needs to be done before you get to the first 100 days. And that's going to be, again, a challenge for whoever comes into this administration. Rightly, in many respects, the various parties are focusing on getting elected and don't want to be seen to be measuring the curtains. But if they're not clear what they're going to do early on, they very much lose that first 6 months, even longer, as they try and figure out what's next. And then the final one is actually about building alliances across the policy cycle. The visual there, which is in the book, is actually a very simplistic representation of the policy cycle. The focus being how you get from government ambitions to results for and with citizens and the various elements of it. Now, the center of government has a role within each and every aspect of that, variable, of course, and depending upon the state of the particular government in question. So again, that might raise some questions when we get to the discussions. The next is actually just to reinforce the needs to both lead and to manage. It would be easy to read what we're talking about because we are trying to get to some of the technical elements of the way in which a center of government works. The leadership is important. The leader sets the tone, as I'll say in a minute, actually signals what matters. And there are things that can only be done by the center of government, and they shouldn't do things that can be done elsewhere. The visuals there are quite important. I very often describe being in the center of government a bit like conducting an orchestra, where every department or line ministry is a soloist who may or may not be playing from the same score. And unless it's conducted, not controlled, but conducted, it ends up, as the bottom visual, as a set of silos. And the reality is that citizens don't actually experience government in ministerial silos. Departments are a good way to manage money, but a reasonably poor way of actually managing public service delivery. And so thinking about that, again, rather matters. It is important to say that if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. And it's really very, very clear is during the work we did that the things that most governments care about are cross-governmental. So it's actually about breaking down those silos and getting a whole of government approach to it. And doing that is a challenge. And the point I make there is about being a great politician is not the same as being a great manager. And everybody talks about applying business principles to government. Government's much more complicated than many businesses, most businesses. And so although there's some principles and tools that are useful and can be adapted, it's not the same. And it's important to say it's not the same. But having said that, some of what we learn from business is actually routines matter and disciplines matter in terms of helping to drive both good government and good delivery. Now, the next one is about considering the people elements of reform. One of my bugbears is that very often reform narratives are off the back of poor performance. And actually taking that as an approach is hardly a way of motivating the people who are going to need to develop and deliver the new reform. And the point I'm making in the first bullet there about frontline services being delivered at the front line, what you've got there in the visuals are teachers and doctors, firefighters, police officers, and so on. They're the ones who are actually engaged with the public and actually ensuring that they're both motivated, skilled, resourced, and so on. A current real issue within the UK after many years. It's also worth highlighting that policy announcements, which of course in a world of 24/7 social media and news runs, there's a need for governments to make announcements, to develop policies and to promote them, but they don't produce outcomes. And actually, if the center of government focuses just on policy announcements and not on actual delivery, then the civil service and those others, the people involved, will pick up that that's what they want and actually prioritize that. And the final point there is that public service ecosystems are different. The ecosystem of education, if there's a system at all now in the UK, is very different than the justice ecosystem or the police or fire service, was much more command and control. They demand different sorts of approaches. And while most civil servants worldwide are reasonably good at policy development, unless they understand what frontline delivery looks like, the policies are likely to be undeliverable. Which leads to my final point. The government actually creates a set of a climate, a culture based on a set of values, which may involve respect of the civil servants and those that will translate their vision into reality. But again, the point that I made earlier on, subsidiarity matters. Government doesn't actually engage directly very often. It does on some in terms of taxes and benefits, but doesn't actually engage directly on many of the things that actually matter to them and to citizens that elect them. And so thinking about the culture and the values which will promote trust or not promote trust, and devolving decisions to the lowest position possible. And when I say that, of course, I mean local government, but I also mean civil society and those within communities, because they play a huge part within the UK. Now, again, I hope that gives us enough to have a bit of a discussion. Martine will now share some of the learnings we had from the international work that we did in terms of creating the book and some further things that he's learned over the years. And so I'm delighted to turn over to him. Martine.
Thank you, Ray, and thanks to Patrick for the invitation to present today. It's always a challenge to follow Ray, especially today that he's wearing a tie. But I'll try to rise to the occasion. So I'll be presenting some recent trends and lessons from COG practice internationally that hopefully will also resonate to our UK audience. The first thing we can say is that COG reform is not a fad. It is here to stay. And we see a large number of reform initiatives internationally. We see a body of experts, of practitioners, some of us, some of whom are with us today in the audience, are around the issue of COG reform. And I think there are three main factors that drive this interest, and probably will continue to drive this interest in the work of the COG. The first factor is this increased attention being paid to a range of whole of government approaches, which sort of necessarily entail some sort of coordination from the center. And let me just name a few. So everybody's talking these days about a mission-driven approach to governing, and I know in the UK this is going on as well. So the idea is to replace the traditionally discrete sectoral interventions of ministries and agencies with an integrated effort to tackle major and cross-sectoral policy challenges. This is not entirely new. We have all reports, for example, from the United States urging to reorganize government around missions, but clearly this idea of mission-driven governing is growing and will continue to grow. Similarly, there's a lot of interest in what's called place-based approaches. The idea that, again, you need to tackle complex interrelated issues simultaneously in specific communities or locations. And we see this in many countries with an increased interest in infrastructure policy, industrial policy, aiming or claiming to use this approach. We also see that many countries are trying to redesign policy from the perspective of citizens or users, again, with the idea of breaking down institutional silos in design and implementation. And finally, many countries are developing these cross-government data and digital strategies that also aim to enable collaboration, information sharing across administrative boundaries. So many of these contemporary approaches and techniques of governance, by definition, demand an active center to lead these sort of cross-cutting efforts. The second factor is the need to deliver results when trust in government, as Ray said, is low in so many countries. We know that trust is not entirely, but at least partly shaped by results. We also know that a systematic focus from the center can help to accelerate results and to communicate them coherently. So it makes sense in this context to seek to strengthen the COG. And finally, the third factor that I think explains the interest in the work of the COG is the perception that certain transformations and risks have become so accelerated and exponential and multisectoral that only the center can mobilize the type of rapid and coherent response that is needed to tackle those risks. And the pandemic, as Ray and Patrick mentioned, is of course a prime example of this, but as shown in the slide, there are many others. So I think there are a number of reasons why the work of the COG has become, and I think will continue to become, increasingly important. And we do have a number of successes that I think we can confidently attribute to the work of the COG. So as shown in the slide, there are many examples in which the prioritization, the cross-ministerial coordination, the active monitoring from the center were truly decisive in generating results for citizens. But I think we also need to acknowledge, and we've learned this with Patrick, Ray, and other colleagues, that many COG reforms have also been short-lived. They have not produced measurable improvements. And in this publication, we identify four recurring challenges that we believe explain most of these disappointments. The first one is that many of these reforms have relied almost entirely on the sponsorship of the chief executive, the president, the prime minister. But naturally, their time and attention tends to get diverted. They have to face emerging crises. They need to make new policy announcements, et cetera, et cetera. So when this happens, these types of COG reforms lose momentum. The second problem is that oftentimes these new routines are introduced with little connection to existing processes, such as the budget cycle, as mentioned by Ray. And these existing processes have their own timelines, reporting instruments, incentives for compliance. So if this happens, ministries and agencies will naturally follow the money and pay less attention to these new routines. The first challenge we identified is that many of these reforms are limited to the apex of government, or at best to central government more broadly. But as Ray said, delivery is often the responsibility of subnational entities or external partners. So unless the routines include these other stakeholders, the center will actually have limited influence on delivery. Finally, even when the new COG teams are perceived as successful, they are often burdened with additional tasks that divert their attention. Or sometimes we also see that there's a proliferation of units at the center, so that teams both at the center and in ministries and agencies become overburdened with complying with reports, requests, etc., instead of actually trying to improve performance. So there are certain challenges that any COG reform effort we think would need to address. So on the one hand, we know that COG reform is relevant. On the other hand, we have identified certain challenges. What can we do about this? And let me very quickly cover 5 practical recommendations that we've included alongside many others in the report. The first one is to try to innovate and explore new instruments when promoting cross-ministerial work. So in general, the immediate response to any multi-sectoral policy challenge is to create a new interministerial committee. But we know that these type of committees are effective only in certain conditions. For example, when there is an active participation by the chief executive, or at least by other very senior figures. And we know that this is not usually sustainable. So there are a number of tools that could be considered to complement this effort. So New Zealand, for example, has explored with a new approach to collective accountability or collective responsibility, so that all agencies that contribute to a shared outcome share the responsibility for delivery. Of course, this potentially creates new challenges, but at the same time, it can also increase the commitment of all stakeholders as compared to the more traditional approach in which one of the ministries has the primary responsibility, and therefore the primary credit for achieving the goal or the primary blame for not achieving it relies on only one of them. Peru has established outcome-based budgeting for certain early childhood development indicators. This is a typical type of policy issue that requires interventions from multiple ministries and agencies. So instead of allocating resources by institution, as traditionally done, in this approach, they try to, the allocations were determined jointly, so that they were allocated to each ministry according to the outputs that each of them had to deliver to deliver on those outcomes. And finally, many countries are trying, as I mentioned before, this idea of a systems approach to policy design. So instead of the usual discrete and fragmented way of designing policy, taking an integrated view of the situation. For example, by taking the perspective of citizens, you can identify how the existing policies interact, whether there are synergies, contradictions, etc., and ideally try to restructure that. For example, the US at the federal level has identified what they call these life experiences, and they're aiming to redesign the way each agency designs their services in a more integrated way in these life experiences. So these are just a few examples. The main message that we have here is there's more to coordination than just setting up a cabinet committee. Second recommendation is to go beyond the apex of government. Of course, reforming the central government is itself very ambitious, but it's often not enough to sustain change in time. So in certain conditions, it may be logical for the COG to take into account, to oversee the capabilities, the culture, the tools, the structures of the wider delivery system. For example, making sure that the management teams in the implementing agencies have the right skills for the job, that their organizational structures are fit for purpose, that bureaucratic inertia is not preventing the introduction of new ways of doing things, etc., etc. Of course, there's always a risk of overstretching the COG's resources, so this should be done selectively, again, focusing on priority goals rather than reforming the entire public sector. Recommendation number 3 requires some audacity, basically to make sure that any administration's priorities are widely known by the public and that progress is being reported periodically. This is a way of motivating ministries and agencies to maintain the focus on the priorities rather than their own ministerial or personal agendas. For example, in Buenos Aires, within the first 100 days in office, the mayor announced 20 measurable targets with very clear deadlines. And very periodically, we're doing these town hall sessions to update progress and explain to citizens, to journalists, how things were going. And this helped to raise the visibility of these goals. And as a consequence, again, helped to ensure that ministers and their teams kept their focus on these goals. Fourth recommendation is to take the alignment with the budget process seriously. As Ray said, the Ministry of Finance needs to be on board with any new COG routines. And in a way, this is more feasible than with older sort of all-encompassing planning efforts, which sort of assume a zero budgeting approach to allocating resources, because in COG reforms, we are usually focusing on a narrower set of policy priorities. And to do this, we cover a range of potential instruments to try to secure this integration, from very basic ones like the one we mentioned in Chile, to more ambitious efforts like full-scale spending reviews as done in some OECD countries. And again, this will the right tools will vary depending on context. And finally, the fifth recommendation is to begin any effort with an honest assessment of the current operations of the COG. Sometimes new COG units are established to follow international trends, but this typically creates more problems than solutions, or it tends to overload the system. The publication includes this self-assessment maturity matrix. The idea is to help guide practitioners in identifying where the key gaps lie, which functions like strategic management or which components within that functions are presenting the larger gaps, in order to focus the reform efforts on those specific activities. So to sum up, there are many reasons why we think COG reform will continue to be an increasingly important field in public management reform, but we also identified many failed efforts as well. What I've tried to cover very briefly is a group of practical recommendations to try to address these barriers or challenges. And there are a few principles that underpin these recommendations, and let me very quickly list them. So in our experience, routines and tools matter far more than the configuration or structure of the COG. We face, in many countries, incoming teams that ask about the organizational chart. Of course, you need to avoid duplication. You need to make sure that roles and responsibilities are clear, but tools and routines matter far more. Second, as I said before, COG reform works best when it tackles a meaningful gap in performance and not just importing what has worked elsewhere. Third, and I think Ray touched on this as well, is the work of the COG is oftentimes to make sure that the broader delivery system is in place rather than assuming any sort of direct ownership of these goals. And finally, if we're thinking of incoming teams, it seems very sensible to plan ahead. We've identified that coordinating successful transitions in government can only be done from the center, because it's the only actor that has this sort of cross-cutting perspective. But it's also in many countries a very underdeveloped role, and there's not enough advanced planning for this. So with that, I hope I stayed within my 12 minutes and look forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Well, thanks so much, Martin. I think an awful lot of content there and idea to think about. I'm going to hand straight over to Caroline, because as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, Caroline has significant experience of working at the centre of government in the UK. So I think it would just be great to get some reflections from her about what she's heard so far, how that connects with the reality of what Caroline saw in government itself, and also what that leads her to think about what the priorities would be for an incoming government in terms of how to structure the centre of government. So with that, Caroline, over to you.
Well, thank you. I mean, such interesting presentations, and indeed the book, is also well worth a read. I mean, it is so important, isn't it, to get delivery right? You know, I think at the moment we're seeing a government that's probably better at politicking than it is actually at governing. And, you know, it is a difficult thing, which I've witnessed shifts over the course of my career in how to do this. I think the one thing I would say to start is I think government in the UK is too centralised. And I don't think setting up a separate Prime Minister's department would make that any better. In fact, I think it would probably make it significantly worse. And actually, we saw some of the problems with that during COVID, where the government really bypassed very effective local authority level public health professionals who knew their patches, who knew how to do things, and created lots of new structures. And I remember Danny Kruger saying in a meeting I attended, you know, he said, you know, you need to sweep all that away when you get into a crisis. You've just got to sort of centralise. And actually, that's the reverse of what you need to do. So I think devolve, which is a message that's come through in these presentations, you know, down to the lowest possible level, Ray said. I absolutely agree with that. And I think place-based results are where the most effective things are happening now at the moment in Britain. And so I think we need to, when looking at the design of the centre, we need to focus on what only the centre can do. And I would say that that includes, as Ray says, being clear about the end results you want. I'd call that vision. And whatever you think about the Thatcher government, which I was part of as a civil servant, you know, I think it wasn't short on vision, and that actually helped it to deliver. And that clarity of purpose and what you're trying to achieve, I think, is really important. And it has to be long term. I would say not just 5 years, but actually you do need to start government thinking about 10-year horizons, even if you're not going to be there for the whole time, because the significant changes you make in society can only be delivered on the long scale. So I think, you know, long-term planning, a clear sense of mission, which is very much mentioned, and was interested in the Peruvian examples of outcome-based budgeting. Budgetary alignment, yes, absolutely. Clear values. I think values, you know, trust, integrity, these things really matter. But when I was working for Gordon Brown as an advisor, I introduced public service agreements. These were the first objectives and targets in government. And looking back on that experience, I think of it as it's rather like a sort of large megaphone. You're sitting in the centre of government with, actually, when you sit in the centre of government, even number 10, believe it or not, you don't feel all that powerful. And you get this large megaphone and you're going to be absolutely clear as exactly what you want them out there to achieve. And you believe that you're pulling levers like this and, you know, out there at the end of the long chain of activity, somebody's going to do what you want. And, you know, my experience since really is that doesn't work that terribly well. So I think I'd give a bit of a challenge to some of the sort of new public management that I think still persists. You know, I think being clear about what you want to achieve, being clear about the outcomes you want is absolutely essential. But targets can lead to some of the problems mentioned in the report, in the book. You know, creaming, gaming. And I think that also we've squeezed out a lot of value from the front line, both the value by tight unit costs that allow people to have some autonomy and ability to respond to circumstances, but the ability really to respond to real needs. So I would say we need to look at that. So I think, you know, outcome-based budgeting is something really to be thinking about there. I also think that, and this has come through from the presentations, the need to engage more widely, not just to focus in narrowly on the government machine from the minister down to the frontline person in some far out public agency, but also to spread wide and engage with broader society, because most of the outcomes that government wants to achieve are actually cannot be achieved by government. You know, they have a small element of it. The health, for example, is achieved by so many different players, including individuals, but also businesses, the social sector. So actually, wider engagement, starting at the top, but also infused throughout the whole chain of delivery with you know, the citizens for whom we serve and with the people who help to make these outcomes happen, is more likely to achieve real results. So I think Ray's analogy of the orchestra, the conductor with this very diverse orchestra orchestrating, I think is a very valuable way of moving from the megaphone really to a different kind of government. And I would emphasize the importance of trust, engaging trust, having standards and values, leading by example from politicians, because I think that's very corrosive, not just in trust from the public, but also in trust from those, down the management line that are trying to deliver things. So I would say that actually we need a bit of a revolution in how government's done, but I wouldn't reach for machinery of government changes. And just as a former Treasury official, I'm also going to say that I think it's absolutely vital that you have a very good way of aligning objectives with budgets, because otherwise you just have big aspirations which can't be delivered. And one of the things the Treasury has done up to a point, it needs to reform itself, is to do that. If it keeps in mind both what you're trying to achieve and what the money is needed for that, I think is good. So changing the Treasury again, I think might not work. I think ministers actually in government need to be clear about what they want to achieve, and they need to make these institutions work for that purpose.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Caroline. Again, I think a lot to think about there. We've got some really good questions coming in on the chat, so do please keep sending in your questions. I've got a couple of questions I've just received, which I want to put immediately to the panel. So, Ray, the first question to you from Jenny Cargill is about the issue of how to decide what sits in the centre of government. Obviously, there is a choice about what functions, what policy areas, what issues should sit within the centre. And the question is really, do we have any guiding principles to determine what should sit with the centre of government and what should sit elsewhere, which I think links back to Caroline's point about devolution. And then a question just picking up on what Caroline was just saying from Jack Shaw. Jack says in his question that public service agreements have had a mixed record, but there's also a need to have accountability structures for public services, particularly after the dismantling of the Audit Commission and so on. And so his question to you, Caroline, is do you think something to PSAs should be reintroduced? But Ray, why don't we start with the guiding principles question, and I'll come to Caroline.
Okay, thanks. Really good question. I think there are some principles that ought to guide what's in and what's out. I mean, Caroline mentioned a focus on end results and vision. I wouldn't disagree with that. But I think I'd get more specific in terms of the issue of coherence across government, consistency across government, cross-government issues. I think they scream for the center of government to be playing a part, partly because of the silo issue I was raising earlier on. Anything that's citizen-focused, very often, I mean, as Caroline says, public service outcomes are generally co-produced by government and individual citizens and civil society and so on. Things that are citizen-centered very often will require cross-government. And so that's always a good one to start with. And then finally, the whole issue of values. It is only the center of government that can, again, I buy into all of what Caroline was raising in terms of the issue of trust. It is only the center that can set standards for a whole range of things in terms of both policy development, implementation, and so on. But it's only the center that can set the values that they want to pursue as a government, which, as we know from current issues that are banging around the UK system now, really rather matters more than they ever have done previously.
Thank you very much. Caroline, do you want to just pick up the question about PSAs?
I will. I'm just conscious I've got a slightly weak connection. So if it starts to fail, let me know and I'll turn the video off. I think public service agreements were, a bit of a mixed bag and haven't been entirely successful. But, the challenge that we faced and the reason why the new Labour government introduced them was because the Treasury was really just focusing on inputs, just focusing on budgets and efficiency, cutting budgets, really. in a very high level way, not really engaging with the contents of what that money was for and how much was needed for it. So the intention behind it actually was as much from the point of view of officials, certainly from my point of view, to get departments to think what was their fundamental what was their purpose, what were their objectives. And the targets were a sort of subsidiary of that. And I think they gained greater importance, partly because the incoming government came in with a very target-based approach. So my internet's unstable. I'm going to turn my camera off. So hopefully you can still hear me. But I think the most important thing about the public service agreements, which we still do need, is that some of them, a significant number of them, were cross-cutting. So, for example, there was one on the criminal justice system, and we need that kind of cross-cutting thinking about what you're trying to achieve and who is responsible for what. And I think they can be very helpful in clarifying that. I think that also we do need some, very clear accountability to the public. If you don't have that, then the whole thing starts to break down. So you do need some deliverables. And I do think, they may not be single targets, but that you do need deliverables. So I do think we need them. And when the public service agreements were watered down by the current government, I think the coalition government, they actually became much less useful for accountability. Mm-hmm. So some reform, but some of that thinking. But I think it's the objectives and the overarching and cross-cutting nature of them that is the most useful.
That's great. Thank you, Caroline. So I've got a couple more questions which I want to put now to Ray and Martine. So I'm going to paraphrase these questions, but we have a question from Graham Pendlebury, which is about really the quality of people working in Number 10. Now, Graham says in his question, let's not worry about structural reform. Let's instead focus on bringing in experienced staff who've got the capability to get things done, instead of relying on what Graham refers to as 20-something staffers who don't have experience and capability. So it'd be good to get your thoughts, Ray and Martine, on this question of how important is it to have the right people in the centre of government? And I think there is a specific UK issue about, do we have too many political advisors around the centre? Is that something that needs to be looked at by future governments? So that's one question. And we also have a question from Philip Craig, which is about the strategic framework around the centre of government, what processes we use to ensure that departments can contribute, I guess, in a joined up way to delivering public services effectively. Obviously, spending reviews are part of that, but there are other processes that can contribute towards joining up and trying to remove silos. So it'd be good to get any thoughts you have about what is the best way that the centre of government can put an effective strategic framework in place. But let's maybe start with the people question. Ray, do you want to address that point about the capabilities of the people at the centre?
Sure. It's a really interesting question. Of course, it totally makes sense that if you've got a job that needs doing, you want somebody who's capable of doing it. Although I'd caution about, and you can see from my own age, about being ageist here. Having inherited a lot of bright young things when I worked in the Treasury, I rather rethought some of the decisions I made earlier on in my career. I previously pretty much always hired people who had proven track records of achievement in particular fields that I was hiring for. And actually, my experience at the Treasury was that actually having some bright young things who basically asked intelligent and challenging questions actually added a dimension to our policy development and decision making. But that required a balance, a few gray hairs and those challenges. But I think that combination got the best. Having said that, I'd say two things in terms of SPADs. In my time, SPADs played a really important role. They actually helped broker things across Whitehall in a way that was actually very, very productive. Having said that, I also recognize the point that you're making, that if they're a bit like kids in a toy shop, and there were a few of them too, then it's actually counterproductive, and very much so, and doesn't actually help the center of government in terms of its relationships with departments.
That's great. Thanks, Ray. Martine, just to turn to you, I mean, you might want to pick up this point about people and capabilities, but also any thoughts you have on getting the right strategic framework at the center of government to make policies and delivery happen.
In terms of the people question, I totally agree with Ray. And in terms of the second question, what we've seen in certain countries is a proliferation of too many guidances or planning instruments that are then difficult to sort of align between themselves, and therefore ministries and agencies become sort of complying with templates rather than actually doing much of real thinking about what they want to achieve. So I guess the overall response I have to that is to keep it simple, to streamline, to have one framework rather than a multiplicity of different guidances that are then difficult to merge into a coherent whole.
Okay, thank you very much. So some further questions which I think it's important we address. One question we've got here is about the turnover of ministers. So the question is, how problematic is the high turnover rate of ministers? How can government insulate its delivery from the impact of that turnover? And I think this is something that's obviously become a bigger issue in the last 10 or 15 years, although it was frankly also an issue under the previous Labour government, the rapid turnover in ministers coming into departments and the problem that creates in terms of coherence around policy and delivery. And then there's also, I think, a very important question here from Ruth Garland about the changes that happen when new governments come to office and the way in which often delivery structures are dismantled in ways that actually could be counterproductive. She refers here to the example of local strategic partnerships and how those were dismantled after 2010. There are lots of other examples that we could think about. So it would be really good to get the panel's reflections on this question about turbulence in delivery structures and also the problems around the high rate of turnover of ministers. Caroline, I mean, obviously you've worked closely with ministers in your career. Would you like to maybe pick up specifically this question about ministerial turnover?
Yes. Well, I think it's bad for government. I think everybody can see that, and you know, it's often accompanied by initiativitis, which you know, is about ministers trying to get promoted as quickly as possible, so that or keeping their job in another place when a new prime minister comes in. So you know, it actually works against many of the things that Ray and Martine have been talking about. In terms of continuity and consistency. So, but also they can't challenge and they can't, you know, relationships matter in government. So, you know, you have to form a whole new set of relationships that just slows the whole machine down. Can I just comment on local strategic partnerships? Please. Because when I was head of early years and childcare in the Department of Education, and we were rolling out a massive expansion of nursery education and childcare, we had early years and childcare partnerships, which I think evolved effectively into local strategic partnerships. And that was such a good way of doing things. You know, it brought intelligence into the machine so that, you know, we knew what was deliverable in a way that's really been lost, I think, in many cases. And but it was also an example of this working across and beyond governments. You know, because you can't deliver those things and lots of other things without that. And then you see today the government charging ahead with new announcements on childcare without really doing their homework as to what's deliverable. You know, it's a sort of opposite example of that. And just finally, just can I just say that in Thatcher's and Major's number 10, there are about 100 people. Most of them were cleaners or messengers. There are about probably 20 to 40 effective, you know, people who are operating, trying to ensure delivery. And nobody would say that the Thatcher government didn't deliver things. So you don't need huge numbers, you need quality.
Great points. Thank you very much. Ray, do you want to pick up maybe the point about delivery structures, but also I'm sure you've seen plenty of ministerial turnover in your career. What are your reflections on that issue specifically?
I don't think I'd have anything to add to what Caroline says. It is entirely disruptive, and there are varieties of reasons for it, but it just doesn't support good governance. By the time a minister actually learns their brief, they're already beginning to look very often for the next brief. And it's just, as I say, counterproductive. I also think, and I associate this in terms of the broader structural issue, both machinery of government change, the change government officers, local strategic partners, and so on, is about a pretense of change rather than serious change. At the end of the day, the services that people rely on and the functions that needs to be done are done by people, and they're not just interchangeable parts. And so my take would be about investing, and rather than radical change or transformational change, doing it more systematically and supporting the people, because you just can't, whole scale shift people out and shift new people in, nor would that be appropriate. But the second thing I'd say is partly related to the ecosystems point I was raising early on, associated with the respect point I was raising early on. Government relies on local organizations and systems and structures in order to make them work. Local government now is a patchwork of municipalities, local authorities, single authorities, two-tier authorities, local mayors, regional mayors, and so on. And that makes it much, much more difficult in terms of thinking about reform. And actually, one size doesn't fit all, but somehow people need to think, governments need to think about its interface with these local groups. Schools, exactly the same. Some schools in local authority, some schools in academy change, some schools as single academy sole traders, and so on. Makes it that much more difficult to support the development of standards and sort of meet the needs of local communities in a systemic way. I think that's it.
Okay, thank you very much. So we've got some more excellent questions coming in, and I'm going to come to Martine first, and then I'll come to Caroline and Ray. So just pick up on the questions that you feel are most relevant to your own experience. We've got a point from Leighton Andrews here, which is about the fundamental changes to machinery of government that are made, and whether, in fact, the key issue is not so much changing structures, but how to restore trust in public institutions. Leighton here refers to the breakdown of public standards, and he argues that if we're going to restore faith in government, we have to address that rather than just simply focusing on machinery of government changes. So it would be good to get your reflections on this question of how to restore trust. Then we've got a really important question from Natalie Gonzalez, which is about the relationship between departments and the centre. And she's, I think, asking here, how does the centre of government help to break down conflicts between departments? I think we often see that it can be very difficult to make policies happen because of disagreements between departmental officials. So what's the role of the centre of government in terms of dealing with those disagreements? And then finally, a question which I think is at the heart of a lot of what we've been discussing today from Elliot Wilson, which is about the Hallett inquiry into the pandemic and its handling. And he asks, is the dysfunction which has been exposed institutional, systemic, and how much of it is due to bad or incompetent individual ministers, advisors, and officials? So lots to think about there. Martine, in terms of your reflections on international experience, how would you address those questions? Maybe particularly the one which is about how to break down conflicts between departments.
Okay, let me also thank many of colleagues that are asking questions. Jenny, Carlos, Khalid, Natalie, many friends or colleagues are asking questions. So you asked first about trust, and what we've seen, and we have really robust evidence of this, is that delivery matters and communicating results from that delivery matters as well. So there are experimental evidence about accountability and how that helps improve trust in government. So I recommend taking a look at the publication because we have data on that. In terms of the second question you posed about conflict, so I mean, I think Natalie, who is part of a great team in Chile, doing great work, she mentions about sort of going to the higher ups or escalating, and probably that needs to be the last resort. And this connects with another question from Jenny. So what we've seen in terms of what works in terms of interministerial coordination is that you need to have some sort of decision-making or contestability process in place that is systematic, that is well established, that is well run, for these mechanisms to work. If it's purely informal or purely ad hoc, people try to circumvent the process. They decide to go to the president or prime minister. So unless you have some sort of honest brokering and systematic mechanism in place, it's probably not going to work well. And it also connects with something that I was touching very briefly in the presentation, is to have clarity on the roles and responsibilities when there's some sort of shared result, who needs to do what. Ray had an image of a delivery chain. We don't want to talk so much about instruments in the presentation, but it's a way to clarify who's supposed to do what, no? And to sort of reduce the number of conflicts that inevitably will arise between ministries when things go wrong, to have some sort of ex-ante clarity on who's supposed to do what. So maybe a bit disorganized, but these are a few ideas that I could share about that.
And that's very helpful. Thank you. Caroline, let me come to you. And I don't know if you want to pick up specifically this question about the COVID inquiry, what it reveals, and the issue about, are the problems really systemic and institutional, or are they to do with, as it were, individuals within the system who have made mistakes or behaved inappropriately? What are your reflections on that question in particular?
Well, I'm very clear that most of it derived from just the sheer dysfunctionality of the individuals, and particularly starting with the Prime Minister. When you're in number 10, the Prime Minister sets the tone, and the sorts of things which were happening, which I just couldn't believe. I mean, I knew it was bad, but when I saw the testimonies, it's just so much worse. Could only be happening under someone like Boris Johnson. And, obviously he chose the key people around him. So Dominic Cummings, for example, is a man who was just completely unsuited to doing government, and just creates, discord. Slight chimes there of Thatcher, but I know she created a lot of discord, but she promised. But if to bring harmony, but in government, you do actually need to work together, and it starts in the office and then it spreads out, throughout the rest of government. And so I think that we heard how they worked against the Cabinet Office, and how the Cabinet Office, the relationships with the Cabinet Office were dreadful. And the Cabinet Office is a vital extension of the Prime Minister's ability to coordinate and make things happen. So I blame the individuals there, and it links back to this other question about trust, that you need to get your trust, your values, your vision, your mission, all of these things right, and you need to inspire. I think one of the things which the Labour government got wrong when it came into power in 1997 was that it really, it focused on something for something, getting, money. If you put money in, you get something back. It wanted to show to the electorate it wasn't going to waste money. But it sort of took the employees out of that equation. It was pretty clear that the employees weren't going to get any additional funds, and they weren't communicated to, they weren't inspired. And that didn't help them, I think, in the task of delivering. And just quickly on this point about conflict happens all the time in government. It's actually quite a healthy thing. Different departments have different perspectives, different interests, and it's a role for the centre of government to sort that out. Ultimately, the Prime Minister, but the Cabinet Office and others. And actually that kind of coordination and sort of sorting out, for example, prevention, which is a very big thing, which I think the government's doing very badly, investing in prevention. One department can cut its budget, and that can have terrible consequences for another department in terms of cost, because it cuts back on preventative services, which are only shown in other budgets. So coordination is vital.
Ray, I'm not sure I have to encourage you too much to offer some punchy thoughts on Boris Johnson, but what are your feelings about what the COVID inquiry said so far? And also it'd be great to get your thoughts on the trust question, and then question about departmental conflict.
Well, I completely agree with what Caroline's saying, and I have no doubt it is personal as opposed to systemic or institutional. I know folk who have been working in Downing Street at that time, who got caught up in clearly what was unacceptable behavior. And it clearly was pervasive that this was okay when clearly it isn't okay. And what's emerged is what again, we all knew, which undermines trust in government. If there's a inconsistency of the people who are making the rules not obeying the rules as it was being portrayed, it just is an inappropriate position for government to be in. And hopefully we'll never be in that position again. In terms of conflict, again, I sort of agree with what Martine says, but say two things. One, again, as Caroline was saying, challenge across departments is very often a good thing, but can become disruptive. It goes back to the orchestra. Individual ministers are the big beasts of the government. They have their own, careers. They have their own egos. They have their own ambitions and aspirations in mind. And sometimes that cuts across the whole of government position. Well, sometimes it's their positions are right and need to amend and change the overall government position. But there needs to be a structure and a set of agreed routines that only the center of government can do so that it can be escalated. The most frustrating things is if officials within departments are actually trying to work with other departments, are getting instructions from their ministers not to work with other departments, and there's no way of actually untangling that. It doesn't necessarily have to go to the PM, but ultimately it's the PM who's creating the context and the structure for all of that.
Okay, we're going to finish in a few minutes. Martine, there's one question that's come in that I just wanted to draw to your attention, which is about government delivery. And the question is, are the countries that are doing government delivery particularly well at the moment, that are really able to deliver big, bold policy changes? Do you have any thoughts on that question in terms of your sense of the international landscape and the examples of good practice that you've seen around the world?
I will connect that with a question from Carlos Santiso as well, asking about the city level. I think most of the examples that we've identified recently of strong delivery have been subnational, mainly because they don't have to deal with the mess of macroeconomic global conflicts, etc., but also because they have greater control over the delivery chain. So it's the connection between decision maker and frontline, as Ray was saying, is probably closer. So I think the best examples we've reviewed of specifically delivery of that particular role of the center, I think have come from the subnational level, or at least from central governments that have greater control of delivery chain. I'm always a huge fan of Pernambuco in Brazil, which is a bit dated now, but I still think it's one of those examples, and you could say this country is dead last in student performance, and now it's a top 3 state in a huge country like Brazil. They are dead last in citizen security. Now they're above average. So there are tangible results. And of course, there are sectoral policy reforms in education, in citizen security, etc. As I think there was a question about from Khalid on that. But there was also very clear action from the center. You have a level of prioritization. You have direct involvement of the top leadership in coordinating, in stock takes, in allocating resources. So clearly the center did something differently to achieve those results. So I think that's a case of particular interest if somebody's trying to look at international examples.
Very good. Okay, we're going to have to draw this to a close, but I want to just put a question finally to Caroline and Ray, which is that in the next 12 months or so, there is an expectation that there will be a new government in the UK. And the question is therefore, if you had one recommendation for a reform to make to the incoming government, to the centre of government, so that it's effective and can deliver the policy goals and missions that the government is concerned with, what would that reform be? Ray, let me start with you. What would be your number one priority for the COG reform?
Well, I think any new incoming government will need to rebuild the center of government in terms of who is actually, I mean, obviously, as Caroline was saying, the Cabinet Office plays a critical role. The Treasury plays a critical role. they will need, and going back to one of the earlier questions, they will need to think carefully about the people that they bring into Downing Street, the sort of skills that they bring in, what sort of a capacity and capability they will want to have, and also to think about the essential values and approach that they're going to take to government, reflecting some of what we've been talking about today. But it will need to be an explicit rebuilding of the center of government, including routines in respect. PSAs were replaced by business plans and outcome delivery plans that played nowhere near the sort of part that PSAs did. They need routines in respect of both the support and challenge for departments. And I would say that would probably be my second highest priority. The first is about the people and the structures. The second is about the routines they put in place.
Very good. Caroline?
Ooh, well, I've got about 5, so I'm just trying to choose one. I mean, they're coming with their missions, which I think is a good thing. Setting aside the detail of what they are, I think they're coming with some clear missions. I think coming with a clear vision and with clear values and putting standards back into public life. But if I could just slip in one more, I would give a clear responsibility to the Treasury and the Cabinet Office to invest in prevention and to invest for the longer term. And at the moment, there's no one in government who really is responsible for what I call early action, having been part of an early action task force, which looked at this for over 11 years. And we tried to get the Public Accounts Committee tried to get the Treasury to take it on, but they wouldn't. So I would say, some bring in prevention into the machinery at the centre of government, because that could unlock an awful lot of change in government and much better delivery.
Excellent. Well, we're going to have to draw things to a close there, but I want to just make a couple of closing remarks. I want to just say on behalf of the Marland Institute that we will continue to work on these areas around government reform, the structures and institutions of government, improving the quality of public policy in the UK. So please do look out for all of our publications and forthcoming events. There's a newsletter to which you can sign up, and it would be great if you could be involved in all of that. The second thing I want to say is thanks to everybody who's attended the webinar today, no doubt on a busy day. It's great to have you with us, and also for the excellent questions and comments that we've had, which I think have really made for a great discussion. And on the final note, I just want to thank very much indeed Martine, Ray and Caroline for providing us with their great perspectives in terms of their experience, both in the UK and internationally, I think for giving us a lot to think about. So thanks so much for being with us. Do have a good rest of the day, and we look forward to seeing you soon at another Marland Institute event.